Welcome, dear listener, to Let's Dig Deeper, the podcast where we talk all about archaeology, history, art, and culture. My name is Zinat Haroun. I am a student of classical archaeology at the University of Copenhagen in Denmark, and on this podcast, I'm going to take you along for interviews with some of the delightful people working in the field. And we'll talk with archaeologists, historians, professionals, and more. Hopefully, we'll learn more about the past in the process. And today is a very special episode. I've traveled from my studio in Copenhagen all the way to Athens, Greece, and I'm here at the Danish Institute in Athens, or DIA as it's called, in a makeshift studio. So if you hear any faint background noise from the aircon or a scooter passing by, that's why. And during these special episodes, we'll be talking to some of the most interesting scholars and experts that Athens has to offer. And today I'm joined by Mogens Pelt. Welcome, Mogens.
Thank you very much.
And Mogens, you are an historian and a specialist with a focus on the history of the Eastern Mediterranean. You're an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen and a former director of the Danish Institute at Athens, where we are recording this conversation today. Your research explores the history of Greece from the 19th century and onwards, from independence to world wars, civil conflict, and the country's shifting place in Europe. And you've published widely on Greek history and politics, and today we'll dive into some of the key turning points that shaped the modern Greek state. Now, Mogens, we have to establish something right out of the gate, and that is the question of when exactly Greece gained its independence, and from who? So can you give us the short answer to that question?
Greece gained its independence through a long war of independence or secession, lasting from 1821 to 1830. And it was a war fought against the Ottoman Empire, which at that time was the empire which also included the lands which nowadays belong to Greece.
Great. So with that clarified, let's dig deeper. And you mentioned the Ottoman Empire. So what were some of the main forces that drove the Greek War of Independence back in the 1820s?
That's a very good question. There's a prehistory which is geopolitical in its nature, and that has to do with the turn of Russia towards the southeast. After having conquered, let's say, the southern shores of the Baltic during the wars against Sweden, first of all, in the beginning of the 18th century, the Great Northern War is the name of it, the Russians in the second half of the 18th century turns its forces against the Ottoman Empire, meaning that it created instability in the whole area, but also hopes among some of the Christian elites, or we thought at least, who will become our masters in the future. Some were hoping that the Russians would actually recognize maybe not their independence, but at least some kind of autonomy. Others just wanted to, go along with the winners in this war. This is a natural reaction. And this unleashed certain instabilities and new perspectives of who we should support among the elites. It was not, if you go back to the 1780s, when you start to see some of these reactions, it was not an idea of nationalistic ideology. It was much more an elite project, finding a new, let's say, home or framework for their rule.
So the idea of the revolution as this sort of national awakening, that's not really accurate, you'd say?
Not at that time. It was rather various elite projects, and in its most ambitious extent, it concerned the whole area of what is nowadays southeastern Europe and Anatolia, that is the Turkish mainland. The idea was to create a Byzantine republic, this is the formulation which you will come across, to become either a part of Russia, that was the new Byzantine Empire. The Tsarina of Russia, Catherine the Great, actually talked about a Greek empire. It never became a reality, but it nurtured the dreams of these elites. And then came Napoleon from revolutionary France, fighting wars also in the Mediterranean, conquering land on the western shores of the northern parts of the Balkan area, meaning that it could either, in these dreams, be a republic, a Byzantine republic, or a Byzantine recreated state. And this was the idea all the way to the beginning of the Greek Revolution, which started in 1821. The idea about, let's say, this Byzantine recreation soon lost power for the simple reason that some of the places where the revolution started in nowadays Romania, these attempts failed. The Ottomans were able to fight down this rebellion in these places. So in the end, the rebellion which succeeded and became the state of Greece in the end was concentrated to the areas of Peloponnese, which is just south of Athens, in a very, let's say, small area. And in this process, they started to shift from this idea of a Byzantine empire to formulate its goals as nationalistic goals, a Greek nation, whatever that might mean. There were many, ideas about what it could be. And they also tried to appeal to a European public, especially a liberal public, that they actually were to reintroduce ideas like constitutionalism and nationalism, things which was a part of the French Revolution, but was an anathema to the victorious powers of the Napoleonic Wars.
Okay, but you also mentioned the religious aspect of it, and how important was religion and the Orthodox Church in forging this new Greek identity?
It was important in many respects. We have to say that it was a tradition that you identified, first of all, also in administrative matters as a Christian or as a Muslim or something else, Jew, for example. This was a part of the way in which the Ottoman Empire ruled its subjects. So there existed this understanding of being Christian, Orthodox Christian, Armenian Christian, and so forth. Now we're dealing with Orthodox Christians among, let's say, those people who ended up creating the Greek nation state. The idea I was talking about before, about the Byzantine Empire, in some of the projects, they actually defined the future citizens of that republic. They also included Muslims, but they were against the Sultan, who was the tyrant. This shifted when we have the Greek nation state coming into shape, slowly but surely. When it was Christians, they would be the future citizens of that state. And that was also very clear in, let's say, the revolutionaries' treatment of the Muslims. The living Muslims here in Athens. There was a minaret of the Acropolis. They had the headquarters of the Turks, as we call them sometimes, the Ottomans, in the Peloponnese. And the Greek revolutionaries slaughtered the Muslims in these places. So it was a fierce also war with, let's say, a kind of ethnic cleansing. The word did not exist at the time, but in structural terms, it's similar to what we nowadays call that.
And it was based in religion.
Yes, I mean, it was not so much about what you, in your deep heart, believed or felt. It was an identity.
What you checked the box as.
Yes, exactly.
But let's skip ahead to the beginning of the 20th century. So by this point, Greece as a nation state is pretty much fully fleshed out. But something was going to change the trajectory of the modern Greek state forever, because in 1914, Franz Ferdinand was shot dead and World War I broke out. And Greece's position during World War I was a bit complicated. Can you explain some of the internal divisions that were at play then?
Yes, it was one of the worst conflicts in modern Greek history, the conflicts around on which side Greece should align itself at the outbreak or after the outbreak of the First World War. There were three options actually. There was one option to go with the Entente powers, that is Britain and France and Russia. Another option was to go with Germany and Austria and the Ottoman Empire. And the third option, of course, was to stay neutral. Now, in practical terms, if you wanted to go with the Germans, which was, I think, what the king wanted, he was impressed by the German firepower, there was a technological advanced power, he believed in the victory. But because of Greece's geopolitical position in the Mediterranean and the fact that the British Navy, Royal Navy, was present here, it would be suicide to join the Germans. So what he wanted was neutrality. Also in order to keep areas which Greece recently had won in the Balkan Wars, which is also nowadays parts of Greece up in what is at that time called Northern Greece or Macedonia. Not the state of Macedonia, Northern Macedonia, but an area. The Prime Minister wanted to join the Entente powers. He believed they would win, and the Entente powers promised Greece territory in many places, in particular of importance for the Greeks, who wanted that solution in Asia Minor, that is in Anatolia, where nowadays you will find a place like Izmir, Smyrna at the time. And there was a hope that this, dominance of the western coast would also unleash the transfer of Constantinople, Istanbul, to the Greeks. This was a split. Prime Minister was the elected man, the elected representative of the Greeks, but the king actually ousted him because of this conflict. He won another election, the prime minister, and it happened again, and Greece split into two entities, southern Greece under the king and northern Greece under the prime minister. In 1917, the Western powers, the Entente powers, Britain and France, lay a siege around Athens, landed troops, and ousted the king so that Greece could be united and join the Entente powers against the Central Power. So Greece was on the winning side of the victors after the end of the First World War and was lavishly awarded for this effort, getting, among other things, control on the western coast of Asia Minor.
Okay, but then in 1918, the war ended, the First World War ended, and Greece, even though they were, as you say, lavishly lauded with awards for their efforts, did not immediately find complete peace. A new conflict broke out with Turkey over the territories of the Ottoman Empire that had fallen by this point. So what were some of the main points of this Greco-Turkish war?
It's an important question, and thank you for asking me. First of all, we in Denmark and the West have a certain habit of believing that the First World War lasted from 1914 to 1918. But if you were a Greek or a Serbian or a Turk or someone living in this area here and all the way along the eastern borders of what is nowadays called sometimes Europe, you would know that the war actually lasted much longer. In this area in Greece, it started in 1912 with the Balkan Wars, and it ended, as you mentioned, in Turkey in 1922. The war in 1922, or the war which ended in 1922 with the Turks, the Turkish nationalists, began in 1819. It began when the Greek troops moved into Asia Minor, to the western parts of the Anatolian mainland, because according to the treaties in Paris, the Greeks had been awarded that part of former Ottoman land as their zone of administration for in the future to incorporate it into Greece. What was not calculated with at the time was that although the Ottoman Empire signed various agreements as a defeated power, some kind of dictator would call them. They didn't have much influence of the final design of what was left of what was Turkey, very little actually. What was not inculcated in this process was that there was a strong resistance in the Ottoman army among former Ottoman officers, and they would withdraw into the Anatolian highland, reorganize and start to act as a resistance movement against, among other things, the Greek occupation of Western Anatolia. He also fought with French in southern Turkey, got them out. He fought the Italians, southern Turkey, got them out. They fought the Armenians in eastern Turkey and kicked them out. And in the end, they fought the Greek army and kicked them out in 1922.
Okay, so the war ended with Greece losing.
Yes.
And in 1923, there was the Treaty of Lausanne, which forced population transfers on both nations. Can you explain what this treaty was about?
Yeah, it's a unique treaty in its terms, in the sense that it was an agreement between two states, Turkey and Greece. And what they agreed upon was to exchange populations. In practical terms, it meant that all Muslims living in Greece, in the Greek territories, were forced to leave Greece whether they wanted or not. It was not an option, it was a demand. And in exchange for that, all Christians, Orthodox Christians, living in what is nowadays Turkey, had to leave Turkey, whether they wished or not. They were forced to leave. There were some exceptions. The Greeks, the Orthodox living in Constantinople, in Istanbul, were allowed to stay if they had stayed there before 1918, before the war ended. And in Thrace, which is in northern Greece, at the borders to Turkey, the Muslims living there were allowed to stay. Otherwise, they had to leave. Many of the Greeks, so-called Greeks, Orthodox Christians who came from Anatolia were Turkish speakers. Some even spoke Arabic, Kurdish, but it was not a criterion. So claiming that they came home was quite a claim because they couldn't communicate with the locals. And the same for the so-called Turks, who were Greek speakers, many of them, were forced to leave and ended up in Turkey speaking Greek and not Turkey. So it was not a happy event. For the states, yes. In the official history, yes. But if you go to the sources and ask people who was subject to this exchange, you'll get a very different story.
Yeah, and the Greeks and the Turks had lived side by side for centuries.
Yes.
And how would you describe these communities before, but then also after the population exchange? What were the effects of the treaty?
It was devastating to many, in many respects. I mean, if you take the individual cases, people who were forced to leave, they were forced to leave their homeland. Greek Orthodox with their homeland somewhere in Anatolia were forced to leave in a village, their neighbors, their fields, and they would come to Greece as strangers. If we were Turkish speakers, how would they reorganize? How would we be able to communicate?
Yeah.
With difficulty. They also had skills, specific skills, which were geared to the specific place where they live. If you were a peasant, and if you were growing, let's say, olive or something of the kind, and came to a place where you could only grow potatoes or cabbage or something of the kind, your skills would not actually help you very much. You might have been a merchant in one place and came back or came to Greece and would not be able to perform your trade. So they lost, these people, also their possessions from the place where they live. They could not sometimes use their skills, and they were strangers and not welcome. I mean, okay, they were Greeks according to and Turks according to the official narrative, but coming as strangers to a place in Athens where they were not welcomed by the locals.
Even though they were technically
yes.
part back home where they belonged,
yes.
quote unquote. They was not. It was hard for them to assimilate.
For many of them, it was. They became, I mean, within a generation, many of them actually thrived very well, professionally speaking. But in the beginning, it was a big problem. And they kept their memories of where they come from. And for that reason, you will find a different kind of narrative about Greek-Turkish relations. If you go to these sources, we love the Turks, they would say. This was a way to say we went on well along with the Muslims in our cities. We came to their weddings. They came to our weddings. We went to the same marketplace. They even came to the church, some of the Muslims, say the Christians. In Easter time, they were having what you will call syncretism, shared saints and all this kind of stuff. So coming here was a strange place. And the same, of course, for the Muslims going to Turkey.
And at the time, was this seen like generally by the public as a solution, or was it experienced primarily as a traumatic event?
For many, we don't have a clear-cut yes and no to all this. Those who lost would not regard it as a very happy event or a good solution, especially those who lived in areas, let's say among the Christians, in what is nowadays Turkey, where we were not exposed to war. They had a quiet life, peaceful life. Yeah. And the same for the Muslims here, of course. If you had been living in the war zone, if you have been treated to or exposed to the soldiers marching into your village, as some of the Orthodox Christians lived or experienced in Western Anatolia, they were happy to get saved and not killed in this process. So you will get different answers.
It was a matter of survival, basically.
Yes, among.
But then we roll around to the 1930s and the slow brewings of the Second World War. And in 1940, Italy famously attempted to invade Greece. And there was very heavy resistance to this invasion. What were the results of the Italian invasion?
Italy decided to invade Greece on the 28th of October 1940. It's still a national holiday here. It's a celebration because with Greece, a Greek dictator, when Mussolini demanded access to Greece, the dictator Metaxas rejected the demand, the ultimatum, with a no. In Greek, no is όχι, and that day is celebrated as the day of the great no, το μεγάλο όχι. It is a celebration because the Greek troops very quickly managed to push. The Italians were attacking from Albania, next door neighbor to Greece. They pushed the Italians up into Albania. So Mussolini was losing areas. And it was the first setback for the Axis power during the Second World War. Remember, springtime, the same year in 1940, the Germans had conquered Denmark and Norway, Holland and Belgium and France. That was the Germans, but the Axis powers. And now Mussolini wanted to, mix in with that success. Yeah. But he ended up ending the whole thing in would have been defeat had not the Germans come to his rescue.
And the Germans did come to his rescue and kind of saved his coming fiasco.
Yes.
What happened after that?
The Germans decided after some deliberations in the spring of 1941 to actually clean up the table after the Italians. They moved their troops southwards through Bulgaria. They demanded free transit, through Yugoslavia. Serbian officers toppled the government and said no. So the Germans had to fight the Yugoslavians also. It didn't take long time for them to conquer that area also, meaning that in April 1941, the German troops marched into Greece, into Athens, and conquered the country. There were some British troops here who had come up to support the Greeks against the Italians and against the Germans, but they had to flee and they escaped to Egypt, all of them.
But then that meant that Greece fell under Nazi occupation. So was there like an international ripple effect when this happened?
It was a period when Germany was victorious in all the battlefields where it participated. Shortly after the conquest of Greece, they would turn against the Soviet Union. And by the same autumn of 41, they seemed to be on the way to conquer the Soviet Union, which was not the case. We would find out some years later. In the case of Greece, the Germans split up Greece into various administration zones. The Italians got a lot of areas to administrate, to control. The Germans would concentrate on the big cities, Athens, Thessaloniki, and the borders to Turkey. And Bulgaria, which was an ally of the Germans, of the Axis powers, got a part of Greece, which it annexed. So Greece was split into two occupation zones, and a part of it was also annexed by Bulgaria.
Okay, but what was daily life like in Greece during the Nazi occupation?
In the beginning, it was hard, first of all. It was hard from the point of view of surviving. And this was especially true for this place, Athens, for example. During the winter of 1941 to 42, about 40,000 people dropped dead from hunger. Okay. This is not also only malnutrition we are talking about here, but actual death caused by lack of food. Starvation, exactly. The reason was that Greece was not self-sufficient with foodstuff. It had to import it. Now, the Allied forces had made a blockade of Greece. It is international law, the responsibility of the occupying power being able to actually take care of the population of an occupied area. But because of this deficiency of foodstuff, it was difficult to supply the cities with food. Furthermore, the Germans had been disturbing, let's say, the normal economic but also circulation of goods and wares, meaning that foodstuff from the countryside would not come to Athens and other big cities. And for that reason, they simply didn't get anything to eat and dropped dead.
So the people actually starved from that.
And you can also see from statistics that people who were born in the period from 41 to 44 are a bit lower, not as high.
There's a low population from that time.
Exactly.
That's
as
really
an average.
Horrible. Wow.
It was, yes.
And then in 1944, the occupation left, finally, under very heavy pressure from the Allied forces. Their forces were simply needed elsewhere. And World War II ended, but Greece was still in the middle of a lot of turmoil. So how did World War II set the stage for the bitter civil war that followed in Greece?
It was actually furniture of what became the post-war period, including a civil war. The Germans occupied the cities, the Italians had control of the countryside, and then there was Bulgaria, as we talked about. In these areas, there was need of some kind of administrative knowledge, which the locals in some areas began to take over. It was a part of the resistance, or what became the resistance movement, local administration. Soup kitchens was another thing. This lack of food created, to say the least, not only famine, which it did, but also supply problems and distribution problems. So locals would start to organize soup kitchens in order to feed the population in the local communities, in the cities. This was organized within a movement which was called YAM, became the largest and most important part of among all the resistance movements in Greece. It was led by communists, but many of the rank and file were not communists necessarily. They were locals joining in order to get things running. And there was also an armed fraction of this YAM called Elas. This was the armed units fighting the Germans or the Italians or the Bulgarians. There were also other resistance groups, but during the period of the occupation, the YAM Elas, the communist-led resistance movement, became the strongest one, and there were, struggles with the other ones, which they won. So when the Germans left in October 44, most of Greece, not all of Greece, but most of Greece was under some kind of control of the YAM Elas. Now, this was not to the liking of the British. They were in Egypt. They still had imperial ambitions in the Mediterranean, and Greece was an important country from that perspective, from an imperial point of view, meaning that it was against British interest to have Greece run by communists. And they tried to arrange a kind of transitional government, which included some from the resistance movement, some from the old government, which was in Egypt, but it was resisted by the rank and file in Athens. There was an agreement between some of the cadres of the resistance movement to have a kind of a joint government, transitional government, before elections could take place and like that. That government broke down, and people started those from the resistance movement. There were fightings here in Athens in the December 44. Royal Air Force would actually target Athens and bombard Athens.
About that,
Yes, called the December fightings. They would also absorb the British, that is, into their forces, former collaborators, those who had collaborated with the Germans, as their allies against the communist resistance movement. So you will see pictures of British soldiers fighting alongside people with German helmets. These were the collaborators. They would win these fights, and in February 45, the resistance movement would surrender, and that would put them in a very weak position. It also made them subjects to revenge from right-wing groups. So you had a kind of so-called white terror running in Forces 5 and Forces 6, meaning that some of the communists would go to the mountains. This is a Greek expression for saying that you are establishing yourself away from the authorities in order to resist. And this is where you would find in the mountains, in the northern parts of Greece, what became the core of the communist resistance against the national government. The British didn't have the money. They gave up, India, they gave up Palestine, and they also handed over the responsibility of Greece to the Americans, who mingled in this conflict, not so much militarily as with money. But there was a civil war going on here, officially from 46 to 49. So that was the first armed conflict, hot war during the Cold War, because it was communist against what became the Western powers.
Yeah, and as you said, the Greek Civil War is sometimes called Europe's first Cold War conflict. But do you agree with that characterization?
Yes, it's a good way of describing it. We normally say that the Cold War was, without wars. It's not true. We had the war in Korea, we had in Vietnam and many places. But in the European continent, yes, the Greek Civil War was a part of the Cold War. And then we had the wars of the Yugoslav succession in the 90s. That was the last war of the Cold War in Europe.
But then how did the Civil War affect Greek society in the long term?
It had immense effects. Greek society was split into those who were the losers and the winners. And this was something which was run on an official level. If you go to Greek police files, you'll see very little about burglars and traffic, incidents and such stuff. Most of the papers from that period, the files would be about specific person's loyalty. Was he or she a loyal citizen? They had a special expression for this thing called ethnikofron, meaning national-minded. You could be national-minded of a first degree. Splendid. You were national and loyal to the state. No problem. You could get a driver's license, access to university if you could qualify, passport, employment in public sector or in...
All the doors were open.
Yeah. But you could also be a very dangerous communist. In that case, you would be imprisoned. You would be in a prison camp. There were prison camps around in Athens and other places of Greece, in the islands, where they would put the communists, and they would have to be supported by their families in order to survive. And this would go on for the whole period of the 50s and 60s. There would be less prisoners in the 60s than in the 40s. There were executions of communists because of their participation in the Civil War. But daily life was also influenced by that. If you were, let's say, somewhere in the middle between a very dangerous communist and a splendid citizen, you might have troubles getting a driver's license, a passport, access to university. What do you do then? You go to the local police station. Everything was very local here, even in the big cities, because the various neighborhoods had a police station, so everybody knew everybody. For apartment stores, for example, you would need to have a doorman.
A license or something?
Yes. Oh. Who would know who would come and go? If you wanted to buy a newspaper, there was a special newspaper stand. Everything was under some kind of control or knowledge. If you wanted to get the job as a concierge, or as a newspaper stand owner, or as an owner of a restaurant, you needed to be able to inform and be willing to inform the police of who was coming and going. So there would be plenty of information about every single citizen here in the town.
Because the locals would sell out.
Yes, the doorman would, the owner of the shop, newspaper stand would. They were forced to do so, otherwise they wouldn't have the permission to run this business. Some of them, of course, would not really tell much, but some would. So you go down there, you will want a passport, you want a driver's license, and the policeman will say, okay, see what we can do. Perhaps you can tell us which papers are your uncle reading, actually, who comes to his house, and if you were willing to rat on these people somewhere, you would, rise in this system of categories, and you would become, in the end, perhaps, a citizens of the first degree, and you would be able to get what you wanted. We know today that in terms of how many citizens were forming the police, East Germany, GDR, was the place where the percentage between informers and citizens was the highest. But Greece came next, higher than Romania, for example.
Okay.
So everything was influenced by this. And that system did not collapse until 1974.
About that, one thing we haven't really addressed yet, you mentioned it one time, but we haven't really talked about the Greek monarchy. And for those of you listeners who don't know, Greece actually was a monarchy from 1832 to 1924, and then again from 1935 to 1974. But this monarchy was not comprised of some ancient Greek lineage of kings. The monarchy was pretty much imported from mainland Europe. So how did this come to be? Because Greece itself did not really have a tradition for monarchy. The last real king profile you could mention would probably be someone like Alexander the Great.
Yes.
But many would agree that he's Macedonian and not of direct Greek descent either. So how did Greece end up having monarchs that were not inherently Greek?
It was imposed on them. The condition for being recognized after the end of the Greek Revolution, the successful ending, among the nations in Europe was that it was a monarchy. This was decided by the great powers, the five great powers, who had won the Napoleonic Wars, who had been fighting republicanism, who had been fighting nationalism, all these things which we nowadays praise. So for Greece to be accepted, recognized as a new country in the so-called European family, it needed to have a king. It needed to be a monarchy.
Yeah, but who then ended up being the new Greek king?
The first Greek king came from Bavaria, medium-sized European state, not a big power, not a great power, King Otto. And the reason for choosing Bavaria and not, let's say, Britain was simply that the other European powers did not want the king to come from one of the big powers because perhaps he could influence, let's say, the development in Greece in the direction of French interests, if it was a French family, and the same for the British or Russians. So it needed to be a relatively weak power who provided the king, and it became Bavaria in the first place. But King Otto had problems with the locals, and he was forced to leave. And the second king who came was a Danish king, Danish prince who became a king, the son of Christian IX, who is famous for the constitutional issue which lasted 25 years in Denmark. But his son did much better here, actually, in that terms. It was not until the outbreak of the First World War, which we were talking about, that the schism and the rift in the fabric of Greek society and state happened because the conflict between the prime minister and the king. And since then, the issue or the institution of a monarchy was a political issue. It was not uniting, it was splitting society. And for that reason, they established a republic in 1924 because it was the anti-monarchists who won the political struggle after the war in Asia Minor. We had a dictatorship, or rather we had attempted coup d'etat, which did not succeed on the part of the liberals in 1935, so that the anti-liberals or the monarchists came back into power in the armed forces. The armed forces was a faction in Greek politics, and they got the king back to Greece.
In 1935.
35, exactly. And then there was the issue, he went to Egypt and the Germans came. He preferred to stay in London, so he went to London also. And he returned to Greece in 47 after a plebiscite, which was, let's say, not completely fair. Perhaps there was a plurality for getting him in, but still it was a contentious issue. And then in 1967, the Greek armed forces took over power in Greece again, this time for a period of 7 years. They established a dictatorship. The Greek king at that time was a young king. He was married to a Danish princess called Anna Maria. And this king, Constantine II, supported in the beginning the dictatorship. And he had also, some would say, and I agree with them, sabotaged the unfolding of normal parliamentary procedures in Greek politics in the preceding years. So then the military dictatorship collapsed in 74 because of a crisis over Cyprus with Turkey and fear of war with Turkey. The military dictatorship collapsed. The civilian politicians returned, and they knew in order to get some kind of unity in Greece, we needed to solve the problem, among other things, the issue of a monarchy. And it was made there was made a plebiscite, whether or not the Greeks wanted the monarchy to continue, and more than 70% voted against the monarchy.
Okay.
So it was abolished.
So there was a really large anti-monarchy sentiment.
Yes, there was.
Okay, so 1974, the monarchy ends, and then in 1981, some newer history, Greece joins the European Union. So how was that perceived inside the country at the time?
We know, I don't know how many people remember 1972 in Denmark. In Denmark, there was an issue also. There was a majority for joining the EU. Denmark, the main opposition against joining the EU was that it was, a huge conglomerate and it would lower the standards of Danish society. In Greece, it was different. I mean, those who were supporting the EU or the EEC at the time would say it would lift Greece. It would make it more European because we are Europeans already. So all these things which were used as an argument against the EEC in Denmark was used as good arguments for why Greece should become a part of the EEC. They had an association agreement with the EEC going back to the early 60s, the first country at all to get such an agreement. Those who were against would say, well, NATO and EU or EEC, that's the same thing. There was a very, very strong sentiment against NATO in Greece in the 70s because of the military regime, because the Americans had upgraded their presence in Athens, in Greece, or here in Athens, in Piraeus, the Americans had a naval base. They had also in Crete, and they were suspected of supporting the junta. So there was a very strong sentiment against the Americans, against NATO. Greece had to leave the military command of NATO. It was a conservative government in order to please the public mood. And those who were against the EEC would say, okay, this is the same business, so stay out of that.
Same system, just a different name.
Yeah, το ίδιο συνδικάτο. EOC και NATO, το ίδιο συνδικάτο. EOC means EU, EEC, NATO is NATO, and συνδικάτο, syndicate.
Yeah.
That's the same thing.
Same thing.
That was the slogan against.
Okay, but Greece did join the European Union.
Yes.
Yeah, and then we move on up until the 21st century, and then in 2008, something very significant happens. The international financial crisis hits the world, and some countries were affected much harder than others, and Greece was one of them. So what made the 2008 financial crisis hit Greece so hard compared to other European nations?
In the first place, the crisis in 2008 started in America. It was a banking crisis. The trust in banks were dropping, meaning that banks stopped to trust each other because of these bad loans which were made to especially for buying houses with subprime loans and so forth. So it had a banking crisis in the States, which also started to move to Europe. In Greece, it started indirectly as a banking crisis. Greece had raised many loans in the capital markets in Europe from German and French banks, insurance companies and so forth. And Greek bonds were popular among the banks. This is a way how to actually lend money in because the yield was a bit higher on a Greek bond compared to a Danish bond because they were higher risk. On the other hand, Greece had become a part of the Eurozone, meaning that it was it gave it an aura, at least, of being very stable because we were part of the Eurozone. So many banks and security companies, insurance companies would invest in Greek bonds because the yield was higher, and we believed that it was possible to do without too many risks. And then in the end, the Greek state finances had huge deficits. The Greek state was spending more money than they were supposed to do according to the EU standards. This meant that the trust in Greece, in the Greek solvency, dropped, meaning that in order to renew their loans, Greece would have to pay much more, meaning that they actually were not able to pay their debts every time they turned around the loans. Meaning that the banks in France and Britain, Germany and Holland and other places were in danger also of collapsing. And this meant that the EU decided to enter with loans to the Greek state to stabilize the Greek state so that they could pay their debts to the banks and go on running. And this happens. But the problem in the relation between Greece and the EU, in particular on a public level, at least between Greece and Germany, was that the Greek state was demanded to cut down expenditures for social expenditures, changing the retirement age from, let's say, 60-something to 60 much more, cutting welfare benefits. Greece is not what you would normally compare to places like Denmark or Scandinavia. You would not call it a welfare country, but such expenditures was cut down. Meaning that those in Greece who were upset about what happened, about the EU intermingling with the Greek economy, would say that we, the Greek citizens, are paying for, let's say, saving the banks.
Yeah.
But they were also support of this policy, of course, also in Greece. They would say, well, we don't dare dropping out of the Eurozone What about our savings in euros? What would happen? What will happen to Greece? Will it sink down to become a kind of Argentina? So there was also fear. So there was frictions between parts of the Greek public and the EU, and there was also, of course, frictions within Greek society, because there were divided opinions about which was the right way to go. But what is important when we're talking to a non-Greek public is that crisis is not the result of Greeks being lazy or something of the kind. It was much more intertwined with the whole way in which the financial crisis unfolded. And the basis of the frictions between Europe, Germany and Greece was that what was a private debt, Greek state owing money to private companies, became a public debt. A money which Greece would now owe to the European Union. And that would also involve European citizens, of course.
Yeah, and the Greek citizens were hit pretty hard by the crisis, especially in the years following, in a sort of trying to recover from it all. What was life like after the crisis? It
took a long time to recover. I mean, at its peak, I think almost 50% of young people were unemployed.
Okay.
More than 25% of, average age people were unemployed. The GNP dropped by 25%. And this is still full nowadays. The numbers concerning public debt expenditures are now as they are supposed to be according to European standards. But you have much more poor working people now in Greece than you used to have. You have a very significant brain drain. Young people with good educations, high educations, seeking opportunities out of Greece. They are counted in numbers like 300,000 or 400,000 people, which is a lot.
That's crazy.
So Greece is suffering or still being affected very much by the consequences of how the crisis was handled. And this is what we see nowadays. But the numbers, key numbers which created the conflict with the EU, they are fine. They have a stable government in the sense that they have been ruling for some while. But the percentage of the population who actually votes has dropped.
Okay.
So there's it's not a disinterest, but I think
mistrust maybe.
Mistrust and disappointment, or a sentiment that it doesn't really matter what you do, you'll get the same result. So there are consequences, also those effects we don't know what will be in the future. I mean, there is a political potential of some sort when so many people decide not to vote. We don't vote because we are lazy, but because we have no trust in the system.
And from a professional point of view, from a historic point of view, what direction do you see Greece evolving in the future?
To be very frank, I'm not sure. Greece is stable right now, politically speaking. Greece is stable now also economically speaking, I mean in national economic terms. But if you take into consideration the level of some of the people living here, their living standards, and if you take into consideration also the lack of engagement in the political process right now, there is a potential for changes or reactions to that. So there is a potential for resistance, perhaps. Right now, there's a kind of apathy. I'm not sure it can continue. It depends on what happens around the world, and it is not a stable world.
Yeah.
Especially not in Europe.
It's not stable years that we're in at the
No.
moment. Yeah. Okay. Well, Mogens, I think we've reached around the end of this episode. But before I let you go, let's maybe do a quick summary of what we've talked about, or if there is one particular thing that you'd like our listeners to take with them after listening to this episode. Go ahead.
I would actually keep an eye on Greece. Greece is a place where it has been like a cardinal country area for many of the big changes which has happened in the last 200 years. The Greek Revolution, for example, was the first revolution, the first national uprising and the creation of the first national state in the whole area of the Ottoman Empire. And it affected European opinion and the European state system. Yeah. The frictions around the Greek participation in the First World War, in particular Greece's role in Asia Minor, which actually came to nil, was, from the point of view of the British, a way to have Greece as a kind of junior partner for stability in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Truman Doctrine, which provided money from the American Congress to Greece, was a way to stabilize Greece because we fear it would otherwise go somewhere else. So Greece is placed in a very important strategic, geopolitical, but also from a point of view of balance of power point in the greater European world. And by the greater European world or the greater world, I also include the Middle East and Turkey.
All right, well, that's actually perfect. I'm going to be honest, modern Greek history is not something that I myself have had a super big interest in. Being a classical archaeologist, we focus a lot more on the whole ancient aspect of the history. But I think this has really been really helpful. I think I've gained a lot of insight after this, and I think we've all learned a lot from listening to this. So Mogens, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been great having you.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. My pleasure.
And thank you, dear listener, for tuning in to this episode of Let's Dig Deeper. I hope you've learned lots. And if you have any questions or suggestions for the podcast, you can reach us at letsdigdeeperpodcast@gmail.com. Again, that is letsdigdeeperpodcast@gmail.com, or on Instagram over at Let's Dig Deeper Podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so that you never miss an episode. I'm Zinat Haroun and I've been your host. You can reach me on Instagram at @z_archaeology. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next time where we will dig deeper into another topic. Bye!